Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Normally, I plan these presentations to the T, but I'm going to kind of wing it because I wanted to see how the other presentations were going and how to make sure that mine was relevant to the conversation. So bear with me while we just kind of figure this out together in the next 10 minutes. But I really wanted to have us all sit back and rethink what the actual needs are for carbon removal and the research in particular. There's a lot of different perspectives, and the one that I'm coming from is directly from communities and environmental justice advocates that I work with on a day-to-day basis. Folks who may not know much about carbon removal or are really skeptical about it and have a lot of questions. And oftentimes we hear they may not have the information that they need, or that the information isn't being presented in a way that's really digestible for them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those experiences. And really quickly, I'm at Carbon 180, so we focus on federal carbon removal policy. And even though we are really strong advocates for carbon removal, we also recognize not all carbon removal is created equal, and there's a lot of potential negative impacts and potential benefits that can come from a lot of this work. So we think really deeply about not just, how to do markets and how to do large-scale policy, but also who is actually in the room to create these ideas and who's actually benefiting from the policies that we're putting forward. So a really important piece for us is thinking about those that are not always thought about when it comes to developing policy. And you're going to hear a couple of these terms that may show up in this presentation and just generally in the field. I think we're hearing it more and more. There's environmental justice and there's climate justice. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they actually mean separate things. I think when I think about environmental justice, it's really rooted at sort of like a local, regional level, and it can be either a concept, which it is, a field of research. There's large scholarship that falls under environmental justice, peer-reviewed articles, long-standing studies, and it's a social movement. It comes from the roots of the US civil rights movement, labor movements, indigenous rights movements, all wrapped up together. And the real sort of crux of it is that it's a response to environmental racism. So we were hearing some terms like disadvantaged communities, and those have been defined in different ways. Typically, we're referring to Black or Indigenous communities, as well as low income or economically disadvantaged. There's a lot of studies that really show that they have been burdened with disproportionate number of hazards or pollution. And this is directly related to thinking about siting, to thinking about where you do projects, how you do them, and how to make sure that we're actually redressing harms instead of adding to it. And then there's climate justice, which takes more of like a global perspective, I guess you can say, which is that climate change disproportionately affects disadvantaged communities, so globally speaking, but very similar. And that's just an infographic of some examples that we've thought of opportunities to address this in the carbon removal field. And a lot of what I'm going to be sharing about really comes from our environmental justice program, which we've started a few years ago at Carbon 180. And there's sort of three pillars to the work that we do that's going to inform the next half of this presentation. The first is granting and funding. If we want community members to show up, and if we want them to be involved and informed, there's resources that are required. So we think a lot about how do we get money and how do we get technical expertise to community members so that they can show up and participate at town halls, community engagement, research, all these different aspects that are going to inform the work that we do. Policy and advocacy, of course, that's our bread and butter. That's what we do at Carbon 180. And then the education piece, which I thought was going to be particularly interesting for this group here, which is that there's a real need and a desire from environmental justice organizations in particular for honest brokers of information. And I think yesterday's presentation touched on that as well. I believe it was Alex who was talking about involving communities in the research questions and the formulation, and having experts be in the room as resources so that they're not getting disinformation or misinformation from other resources, but they're going to folks that don't necessarily have skin in the game, but are genuinely just doing good information sharing and gathering for the greater good of addressing climate change. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what that education looks like. And we do dedicated carbon removal curriculum for EJ organizations, so we know the type of information that they're going to be getting. Now, I'm not going to say that all of this is necessarily true, but these are perceptions from environmental justice organizations and community members that I want to convey to everyone, which is that a lot of EJ advocates feel that the carbon removal field does not have the answers to the questions that they're looking for. It could be the way in which research questions have been formulated or disseminated that isn't landing, but they feel like when they show up to different events or they go to presentations or whatever it may be, the types of research questions they would ask is not necessarily the types of questions that they would be looking for. And so there's a disconnect there. The second is that for the existing body of work that's out there, not all, but some really do feel that it either hasn't been conducted by a trusted actor, and we spent a lot of time sort of disseminating what is a trusted actor, which I can get into, or that it just hasn't been communicated well. So it may not be digestible again, or it may not be landing in certain ways. And we spent a lot of time sitting and thinking about this. In some aspects, with the questions that have come up, there aren't a lot of answers. I mean, we've heard legal framework questions, for example, where we don't necessarily know what may happen in that certain situation. So we can see where this is coming from, and we also think that there's a role that we can play at Carbon 180 and folks at the NCEC, for example, in making sure that the body of work that actually does exist is repackaged or repurposed in a way that is actually going to land for the folks that are going to be in the room making these decisions. And so the goal here is just to propose to develop a sort of trusted research agenda with EJ leaders and equity and justice on equity and justice research priorities across carbon removal solutions. What I'm just trying to say with all this is really that getting folks in the room together to have them pose the types of questions that they want, and then the folks that have that body of research getting together to answer those questions. And they may need to tweak, they may need to update, they may need to look into some additional co-benefits or whatever it may be, but the goal is that we're connecting the information to the use case, which is community members who are going to have to show up and have developers knocking on their door asking them, can they build this? What does it look like? They don't have that information. And so we're really trying to figure out how to connect the dots here. And just so folks know, I'm not pulling this out of thin air. There's a lot of data points that's backing the type of information I'm sharing. One example is actually from the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or WEJAC. This is very US focused. It is a body of EJ advocates across the US who were appointed by the president. And their whole charge is to inform federal agencies on how to ensure that environmental justice is integrated into all policies and programs and the work that they do. So they came out with a report of recommendations for carbon management last November, which I strongly recommend folks just take a minute to read. I can say pretty confidently, I don't necessarily agree with everything that was in there, but it was really enlightening to know how people are thinking about this and how they're approaching it. One of the biggest pieces that came out was they're demanding for a systematic review of the scientific evidence that's related to risks and uncertainties on carbon management that's overseen by DOE. And they break down what it means to have that systematic review. So they wanted to address certain topics. Again, not saying that these don't exist, but maybe it wasn't meeting up to their standards. I invite folks to take a look at the document. Be undertaken by an independent expert panel. I think a lot of the gripe here is not what is being presented, but who is presenting it or who did that information. So I think, or who created that information or that data. Of course, making sure that all of this is publicly available is incredibly important. I think it just adds a level of transparency and trust. And so really considering making sure that research isn't necessarily behind paywalls or rethinking what can be publicly available versus what has to be behind IP or any sort of other legal blocks. And then lastly, they wanted to provide a plan for how to direct research and funding. So thinking a lot about moving forward, how do we make sure, again, sort of that co-creation of research. And then the last thing, just to wrap up, is we've done a lot of roundtables. We've done a lot of listening sessions with environmental justice organizations one-on-one. And we've asked them, we've presented information to them, we've asked them what they're interested in. And these are just a couple that I pulled out from roundtables. So what are the air quality impacts from DAC over its entire life cycle? And more broadly, where's the research on carbon removal and co-pollutants that's not industry-led or industry-funded? Something that's come up a lot for us. What is considered a safe distance from a CO2 leak, and how is that being considered in siting recommendations? What I take from that is people want to know more about CO2 storage and how to know when it's safe, and how the legal framework is being set up around that to ensure that those safeguards are in place. And then there's some considerations. I think the one in blue was particularly enlightening for me, which was that there was some sentiment research that was done of carbon capture and storage, and they polled registered voters. And there's a huge population of unregistered voters or undocumented workers in the area. So they felt like there was a really big gap in really understanding what the community sentiments were. So just rethinking research methods as well, I think, is incredibly important. And I'm just going to leave you with that. Thank you.